What is the creepiest, most inexplicable thing that has ever happened to you? Story 1. Back when I was 17, I had just gotten my driver's license and went driving around with some friends, as people usually do. Loud music, good times, random pit stops for no reason, the usual. We decided that driving through the back bush area into the rural part of Australia was a good idea at 10 o'clock in the evening. Off we went down the one road that led us through the bush into complete darkness. There were no lights along that road, only my high beams lit the way. As we were driving, we came across an elderly man in a cream suit holding a bunch of slightly wilted flowers, standing with his thumb out. He seemed harmless, so we decided to pick him up. It was no place for anyone to walk. He was a very nice man, well kept with a trimmed beard. His eyes were incredibly bright, a piercing blue color. He said he was out there visiting the site where his loved ones had died. Apparently, he no longer drove after the accident that killed them. We were a little unsettled, but he was kind and polite, so we thought nothing of it. When we came around a corner, he asked if he could be dropped off there. We did so, assuming the site was nearby. He got out of the car, and we shook hands, wished him well, and offered our sympathy for his loss. He replied, "Have no sympathy for the dead. They are free. May God bless you all, children." Then he turned and walked straight into the dense bush and disappeared within 6 steps, as if the darkness swallowed him whole. It has been a few years now, and there has been no news of any missing people in that area. My friends and I still do not know whether it was a dream, a hallucination, or something else. We have gone back to that same place several times, even walking into the area where he vanished, but found nothing. I will not blame anyone for not believing this story, because sometimes I question it myself. But it is a memory I cannot erase, so I guess it must have been real. Story 2. When my father was young, his family moved into a large house in the city center with about 7 bedrooms. He came from a family of 11 children. My aunt took the last bedroom at the end of the hall. Within a few months, she went to my grandfather, a strict and intimidating man who had little patience for children, and told him she had been hearing strange noises in her room. She thought one of her brothers was playing a prank on her. She described the noises as coughing and choking, and it was keeping her awake at night. Fast forward 15 years, and my father was at a party talking to a girl. They got on to the topic of where they had lived, and as it turned out, she knew the house because she had lived there recently. She seemed hesitant, but eventually asked him if he had ever heard anything strange in the room at the end of the hall. She said that when she stayed there, she had heard heavy breathing and coughing. That was when my father truly started to believe my aunt's story. Going back 15 years earlier, my grandfather, skeptical as ever, had gone to the landlord to ask about the noises, wondering if it was caused by the wind or faulty pipes. As it turned out, the landlord's daughter had died of an asthma attack in that very room at the end of the hall. This story has been kept quiet in our family to avoid sounding strange. I might not have believed it myself, but my father is a serious man who would never make up something like that. The house was demolished sometime in the 1990s, unfortunately. Story 3. My girlfriend from college moved back to Denmark after the last semester for good, and I returned to California for the summer. We decided that video calls would be the best way to stay in contact since we could not call each other directly. About a week and a half ago, we were on a call chatting about flights and plans, when I suddenly felt something wet on the top of my foot. I was sitting at my desk with my feet underneath it, so I had no idea what could have caused that. I looked down, and my girlfriend watched as I seemed to have a small breakdown after realizing my foot was covered in blood. I ran downstairs to show my dad and told my girlfriend I would be right back. My dad and I came back upstairs to look around for anything that might have dripped blood onto my foot, but we found nothing. I washed it off in the bathroom, and there were no cuts or injuries. Nothing to suggest it was my own blood. I returned to the call, still uneasy, and decided to ignore it. That is when my girlfriend asked me what may still be the creepiest question I have ever heard. "Who was that man that walked out of your room when you went to get your dad?" My heart stopped. My dad and I were the only ones home that night. To this day, I brush it off as a random freak occurrence, but I can never forget that question. She said she watched him close my door as he left, the same door I had left open on my way down. Story 4. This happened about 16 years ago. I had been living away from home for about 3 to 4 years at that point and was living alone. In the middle of winter, I had an extremely vivid dream. I was in the garage at my mother's house. The garage was nearly empty, which was unusual considering how much junk was normally stored there. I was standing next to a large shelving unit filled with various items, including some heavy power tools such as a circular saw. I heard music and suddenly I was 5 years old again, chasing after the ice cream man who had just passed in front of the house. I heard a crash, turned around, and saw the shelving unit had collapsed and the circular saw had buried its blade into the concrete floor of the garage. I woke up and thought, how strange, then went about my life. About 6 months later, my mother asked me to help her paint the inside of her garage. I went to her house on a Saturday morning, and we emptied the garage into her backyard. I was moving the last of the heavier items while she swept the floor. She bent down to use the dustpan to collect debris. At that exact moment, I heard the familiar music of the approaching ice cream truck. The dream I had 6 months earlier flashed vividly in my mind, and acting purely on instinct, I grabbed my mother and pulled her away just as the shelving unit beside her collapsed. The circular saw fell exactly where her head would have been if I had not pulled her away. That experience is the main reason why I am certain there is more to human existence than what we can see, and it is the only reason I do not fully call myself an atheist. Story 5. I was around 12 to 14 years old. Not sure exactly how old. My best friend was spending the night at our house. We lived at the end of a road on the outskirts of a small town of about 4,000 to 5,000 people. It was nighttime, probably around 9 or 10 o'clock. We were walking and chatting about random things. As we headed away from my house and out of town, we immediately saw 2 small, glowing red lights close to each other. Our road was flat for about 500 feet, and then dropped roughly 50 feet over the next 500 feet, passing between 2 small farms until it reached an old back road. The eyes appeared level with us, which made it seem like they were within that first 500 feet. We watched them for about 5 minutes before they seemed to turn and fade away rather than disappear instantly like a switched-off light. It looked like they moved slightly, though I cannot swear to that. My friend, being braver than I was, wanted to see what it had been. Now that the lights were gone, we went inside, grabbed flashlights, and headed back out slowly. We walked all the way to the end of the road, and everything seemed fine until we heard something large moving down the old road to the right. We decided to follow the sound, even though I was terrified after seeing those red eyes. We eventually reached the end of that road, with light forest on both sides. We did not see or hear anything else, so we decided to head back. Both of us needed to pee, so we stepped off the road just in case any cars came by. I walked off, started unzipping, and tripped over something. I reached out and felt a warm, hairy body, screamed my lungs out, and bolted in terror. My friend ran over, half scared and half laughing, as he shone his light on what I had tripped over. A dead deer. Nothing else strange happened on our way back, but seeing red eyes and falling over a recently dead animal was more than enough for me. Another time, when I was around 6 to 8 years old, my sisters had a slumber party, and they were all up watching television in the living room. Our living room was open and connected to the dining area, separated only by a couch. Next to the dining space was a large sliding glass door leading out to our deck. I had been pestering my sisters and their friends, who were 5 to 7 years older than me, while they watched television. I went into the kitchen to get a drink. The lights were off everywhere except for the glow of the television, but the outside deck light was on. As I walked back from the kitchen into the dining area, I saw a large man standing on our back deck, just standing still. I do not think he could see us, though there might have been a small gap in the curtain. I froze in terror for a few seconds, then quickly went to my oldest sister and told her someone was watching us. At first, she thought I was joking, but I convinced her and one of her friends to look toward the sliding glass doors. The moment they saw him, they both panicked, and we all bolted to the back bedroom where my dad was sleeping. We woke him up, and he went outside where he found footprints in the snow. We never found out who that man was or why he had been watching us from the deck that night. Story 6. A couple of weeks ago, I felt pressure inside my body, but I could tell from the sensation that it was not something major. I decided to wait until my food finished digesting, so everything could pass together. That turned out to be a big mistake. 2 nights later, after nearly 52 hours of holding it in, I felt like I was giving birth to something massive. I applied so much pressure trying to relieve myself that I turned red in the face and felt dizzy, steadying myself by holding on to the towel rail. When I was done, I realized there was no toilet paper. I thought about using an empty shampoo bottle, but that clearly made no sense, so I gave up on that idea. I called out for my brother, but he did not answer. So I awkwardly shuffled out of the bathroom and went downstairs, past my brother who was eating snacks and watching television, until I reached the guest bathroom where I could clean myself in peace. Problem solved, right? Not quite. When I went back upstairs and looked into the toilet, I saw what looked like one massive, solid piece. I flushed twice, but it did not move at all. The water pressure did nothing. I then broke a wooden hanger in half and tried to break it apart. I kept trying until it finally split into a few pieces, but even then it refused to flush away. Frustrated, I tossed the hanger out the window and went to bed. When I woke up in the morning, it was gone completely. There were no traces, no marks, nothing left behind. Either it finally flushed away on its own, or somehow vanished entirely. I have no explanation for it, but to this day I still think about that bizarre experience. Story 7. A few years back, during my first marriage, my former husband and I owned a beautiful house built in 2003. Just like most homes in that neighborhood, the area had originally been a swamp where, back in the 17 to 1800s, indigenous people were known to live. I thought nothing of it until strange things started to happen. My husband worked in mills and would leave around 5 o'clock in the morning, while I left for work closer to 8. It was a ranch-style home with 3 doors, a front, back, and side door. We always used the side door because it led to the driveway and patio. The front door was heavy and had a stubborn lock that took a lot of effort to open. Despite that, every few mornings, I would walk into the living room and find the front door wide open. My husband swore he never touched it. I thought he was teasing me until he went out of town for a week, and it kept happening every single day. It did not matter what time of day it was. I could leave the room and come back minutes later, and the door would be open again. Then one day it stopped. But soon after, other strange things began. Items would go missing. I remember once we both spent ages looking for a dustpan. We searched everywhere, even leaned against the dryer, talking about how strange it was. Then we walked into the kitchen, heard a loud bang, and rushed back. There it was, sitting right on top of the dryer. There were other nights after our divorce when I was alone and lights would flicker on and off, things would disappear, and strange noises echoed through the house. I know it sounds unbelievable, but I have never been more grateful than the day I finally sold that house and moved away. Story 8. Here is another story I once posted under an older account. It happened a few months ago, but I kept the original text written as if it had just happened. My grandmother is in a nursing home after suffering a stroke a few months back. Mentally, she is completely aware, though one side of her body is partially paralyzed and she is undergoing rehabilitation. She has grown weaker due to the lack of physical activity. One Sunday morning, as we were getting ready to visit her like we always did, we received a call from the family of her old best friend. The friend had moved to Florida about 10 years earlier, and they had only stayed in touch through occasional holiday cards. That morning, we were informed that her friend had passed away very early in the day. When we arrived at the nursing home, we signed in and noticed we were the first visitors of the day. We went to my grandmother's room, where she greeted us warmly and exclaimed, "Oh my, so many visitors this morning." We asked what she meant, and she told us she had received a visit from her old friend, the very one who had just passed away. According to my grandmother, her friend told her that she was going away for a while, not to worry, that she would be watching over her, and that they would see each other again. My grandmother also said she looked healthy and full of life. I have never felt chills like that before. Later, I asked the staff if anyone had been to her room that morning, or if any phone calls had come through. They said no, and the visitor and call logs confirmed it. The family of her friend in Florida told us they had only called us that morning and did not even know my grandmother was living in a nursing home. It is possible that she dreamed it, but the timing, the details, and the message are too extraordinary to ignore. Even now, the thought of it still gives me chills. Story 9. My brother had antisocial personality disorder. He ended up on trial for a double murder and underwent a psychiatric evaluation. One day I was contacted by his evaluator and told that when I was a young child around 5 years old, my older brother, who was 8 at the time, would come into my room and watch me sleep for about 2 hours every night. Many times he brought a rope, pillow, or knife with the intent to kill me. Apparently, one night he decided he was going to go through with it and went to get a knife from the kitchen, but he discovered that his bedroom door was locked. From that night on, for the next 10 years, my parents locked his door every night before going to sleep. When he turned 18, they finally asked him to leave the house. 11 days later, he committed the double murder. I always wondered why we never went on vacations or left home for holidays like Christmas and Thanksgiving. My parents had kept everything from me, but it turns out that when my brother was 7, they had caught him in the neighbor's backyard trying to burn the bodies of a newborn litter of kittens. He had beheaded 3 of them and disemboweled another. I had no idea about any of this until I turned 18 and was leaving for college. My parents had kept a close eye on me all those years, but said they never had any reason to believe that I was anything like him. Story 10. I wear glasses. I can see somewhat fine without them, and I am even legally allowed to drive without them. Still, I usually wear them when I go out because it is nice to see clearly at a distance. One night, I left my apartment to go to the library to study. About halfway there, I saw a girl across the street who looked familiar, but I could not quite tell who she was. I squinted to see better and realized I had forgotten my glasses on my desk. I rubbed my eyes to focus, and it turned out it was not her. Since I did not really need my glasses to study, I decided not to go back for them. It would have taken only 5 minutes, but I figured I would be fine without them for one night. A few minutes later, I ran into a classmate from one of my project groups, and we talked for a bit before I continued toward the library. It was a cold night, and when I walked inside the warm building, something strange happened. My glasses fogged up. I froze in disbelief. My glasses were suddenly on my face. I knew for a fact they had not been there before. I had rubbed my eyes earlier and would have noticed them if they had been on. Besides, I could clearly see across the street without them. Completely confused, I stood there for a few minutes, trying to make sense of it. I was so unsettled that I could not study and went straight home. Later, I texted the classmate I had talked to earlier and asked if he remembered me wearing glasses. He said he was pretty sure I was not. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened that night, but it still sends chills down my spine when I think about it. Story 11. Back when I was in 3rd grade, someone in my class had a birthday party. Let's call her Lisa. Lisa lived far out in the woods at the end of a dead-end road surrounded by trees. It was a dark, eerie place, and most of us were already uneasy. We got bored of playing indoors, so we started daring each other to run around the house alone in the dark. Around that time, Lisa told us about a small shack on their property where they used to keep a bull. She said the bull had always been strange, easily startled, and prone to sudden fits of rage for no reason. One day the bull died unexpectedly, and even the veterinarian could not determine the cause. They had always cared for it well, and it had been declared healthy in previous checkups. Her story scared most of us, and some kids went back inside, but Lisa laughed it off and said there was nothing to fear. She and her friend teased the rest of us for being scared and decided to walk up to the shack to prove it. I was standing by the stairs of her house, close enough to see everything clearly since the house and shack were both lit by outdoor lights. Lisa's friend started laughing as she lifted the shack's gate, which opened upward like a garage door. She had raised it almost completely when, out of nowhere, she looked as if she had been struck by something. She screamed in pain, a deep, raw sound that turned into a moan before she collapsed to the ground unconscious. Lisa screamed in panic and called for help. Terrified, I ran inside shouting for her parents. They rushed out, and soon other adults came to help. The party ended abruptly, and I went home without seeing either of the girls again. After the weekend, I barely slept, replaying the scene in my mind over and over until I convinced myself it must have been a prank. When I saw Lisa at school on Monday, I tried to laugh about it, but then I saw her leg was in a cast. She had actually broken it and would need crutches for 6 months. I know what I saw that night, and there was nothing visible that could have hit her. The gate was above her, and the area was well lit. There was nothing there. When I asked her later what happened, she said the only thing she remembered was feeling a sudden gust of wind and then intense pain in her leg. Years later, I have heard all kinds of strange stories, people seeing unidentified lights in the sky or unexplainable things, but nothing has ever stayed with me like that night. I still cannot explain what happened, and it continues to make me question everything I believe about the supernatural. Story 12. I was 16 and driving home alone after spending a week at the beach with family and friends. I was on back roads in the countryside, miles from anywhere, with only the occasional small town appearing every 40 miles or so. Suddenly, I heard strange noises coming from under the hood. Warning lights lit up, and the car stopped running. I pulled over to the shoulder and looked under the hood to find a belt that was torn and frayed, nearly disintegrated. I started checking my phone, trying to decide who to call, when a small car pulled up behind me. It was an elderly woman, maybe around 70, wearing a long white dress that looked almost like a wedding gown. This was in northern Florida in the middle of July. She got out, reached into her back seat, and pulled something out. When she approached, I saw it was a belt, the exact kind my car needed. Later, I learned it was a serpentine belt, and they come in many sizes depending on the vehicle. She just smiled, said nothing, and started working under my hood, removing the old belt and replacing it. Dumbfounded, I tried making small talk, but she didn't answer, just kept working quietly. A few minutes later, she finished, took my hands in hers, looked straight into my eyes, and said, "I was watching you. We all need help from time to time, Airhorn." I froze. She called me by name, though I had never seen her before, and I hadn't stopped anywhere since leaving the beach. My mind raced trying to make sense of how she knew me, or how she happened to have the exact part my car needed. She went back to her car, got in, and drove away the same direction she came from. Her car had no license plate. To this day, I have no idea who she was or what really happened that afternoon. Story 13. It was a normal summer day, and my sister and I were home alone during the school break. My dad had gone to the store and had been gone for a few hours. I was in the attic playing games, and my sister was in her room when she suddenly called me downstairs. I went down and asked what was wrong. Right in front of her room was a small pile of what looked like cat vomit, placed perfectly in a circle. After looking closer, we realized it was tuna. She asked why I did that, and I told her I had been upstairs for at least 3 hours straight. She said she had heard me going up the stairs earlier, only up, not down, and I told her that wasn't possible because I hadn't left my room. She explained that the steps sounded heavy, like someone wearing boots, even though we both weighed the same, and neither of us was heavy. We have wooden stairs, so every step can be heard clearly. I started checking all the rooms, closets, and under the beds, believing her because I also remembered hearing someone come up earlier. I found nothing, but she was terrified, so I stayed with her downstairs watching television until our dad got home. When we told him what happened, he was just as unsettled but couldn't explain it either. The whole thing was strange. The perfect circle of tuna, the sound of heavy footsteps coming up the stairs, and the fact that we were completely alone in the house. Part of me still hopes one of my friends will one day admit to pulling a prank, but our front door is always unlocked when someone's home, so technically anyone could have walked in. Story 14. I was about 5 years old, but I remember it vividly. I came from a big French-Canadian family. My dad had 7 brothers, and we all lived on the same block. My favorite uncle was my Uncle Bernard. He rode a moped, grew plants in his backyard, and listened to 70s rock all the time. He would always take me out for ice cream and never brush me off the way other adults did. We fished together, and he felt more like a best friend than an uncle. One night, I woke up to the feeling of someone sitting on the edge of my bed. I looked up, and it was him. He told me my dad would need me to be extra good and help my mom take care of my brother and sister for a while. He ruffled my hair and said, "Who is my girl in the monkey suit?" He always called me his little monkey because whenever I was angry, I would climb a tree and refuse to come down until my dad fetched a ladder. The next morning at breakfast, I asked where my uncle had gone. My parents looked confused, so I told them what happened. Just as I finished, my Uncle Robert ran into the driveway crying, and my parents rushed outside. My Uncle Bernard had died in his sleep that night. I stood by the window, confused as to why everyone was crying. My mother was so shaken that no one was allowed to mention his death around me. At the funeral, my grandmother, an old, stern Irish woman, pulled me aside and told me I was lucky to have seen a spirit and that the world was full of them if I knew where to look. I was terrified, and after that, everyone in my family treated me differently. Story 15. I had a co-worker, let's call him Dexter. He was always a bit strange, socially awkward, and difficult to be around. I hung out with him occasionally after work, mostly because I felt bad that no one else would. After about 8 months, Dexter decided to join the military, and we parted ways. Honestly, I was a little relieved. I didn't hear from him for years and had mostly forgotten about him until one day he called me from a payphone, asking for a ride from the bus station. He said something about being on military leave, then hung up. I remember thinking it was odd that he would call me instead of his parents, especially since we hadn't talked in so long. When I got to the bus station, he was waiting with all his military gear, but he was vague when I asked about his family or what had happened since he enlisted. He asked if he could come over and hang out like we used to. I wasn't thrilled about it, but curiosity got the better of me. Back at my place, he kept dodging questions and insisted we play video games instead. After a few hours, I asked if he was ready for me to take him to his parents' house. He looked at me with a strange mix of confusion and anger and said, "I thought we were friends." I told him we were, but that I had work the next day and needed to get some rest. He said he couldn't go home because it was too late and asked if he could crash at my place. He promised he'd call his parents in the morning to pick him up before I left for work. Reluctantly, I agreed and let him sleep on the floor in his sleeping bag next to my bed. We both settled in around 2:30 in the morning. I fell asleep quickly. Around 5, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. As I rolled over, I heard soft breathing and saw Dexter sitting in my desk chair, staring at me. My heart stopped. I jumped and demanded to know what he was doing. He said, "I just like the way you look when you're sleeping." I was terrified and furious. I told him, "Don't ever do that." I rushed to the bathroom to collect myself. When I came back, he apologized and said how much he appreciated me being his friend. I told him to go to sleep and that we'd talk in the morning. He started snoring about 20 minutes later, but it still took me an hour to fall asleep. When my alarm went off at 9, I rolled over slowly, dreading what I might see. But Dexter and all of his belongings were gone. I searched the house but found no trace of him. I called his parents' number repeatedly throughout the day, but no one ever answered. It's been over 4 years now, and I've never seen or heard from him again. Story 16. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, I lived in a small house in Duncraig, Western Australia, near Perth. My parents' bedroom was on one side of the house, and mine and my sister's rooms were on the other. The hallway that connected them was narrow. My room was in the middle, and hers was at the end. One night around 11, I was asleep when a loud bang jolted me awake. As a kid, I used to scare myself by imagining burglars or monsters when I heard noises at night, and that's exactly what I did then. My bed was across from my door, so I could see straight into the hallway. That's when I saw it, a figure gliding past my door. It was cloaked like the Grim Reaper, hood and all, and it was floating above the floor. I remember checking for feet and seeing none. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination and started to drift back to sleep when my sister screamed. My dad ran down the hallway and I followed him. My sister was terrified. My dad tried to calm her down, saying she must have imagined it, but I interrupted him. "But Dad, I saw it too." I described exactly what I saw. He frowned and said the only hooded thing in the house was his dressing gown, and that was impossible because it was in his room. I was scared and asked him to check anyway. On the way to his room, we found his dressing gown lying on the living room floor next to the television. He looked puzzled but sent us both back to bed. I was so terrified that I locked my door and slept with the light on. When I woke up the next morning, I had almost forgotten the whole thing until I stood up and felt something soft under my feet. My dad's dressing gown was lying on the floor right beside my bed. It seemed as if it had been standing there facing me and then just collapsed. My door was still locked from the inside. I hadn't gotten up at all during the night. When I told my parents, they brushed it off, saying I was just being silly or trying to scare my sister. I never forgot that night, though. To this day, I still can't explain how that dressing gown ended up in my locked room and the memory continues to haunt me. Story 17. I used to be a skeptic when it came to the paranormal, until something happened when I was about 20 or 21 years old. Every summer, my family would travel to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, then head to Drummond Island. From there, we would take a pontoon boat to a small 3-acre island that had a house on it and spend a week or two relaxing. The people who rented the place joked that it was haunted, saying that years ago a doctor had made a house call there, and the patient had died. We all brushed it off, and for the first 3 vacations, nothing strange happened. But on the 4th trip, things changed. One night, I woke up to use the bathroom. To give an idea of the layout, my sister and I shared a room, and when I sat up in bed, I faced the small nook where her bed was. She would have to walk around the corner of the room to get past my bed. As I stood up in the dark, I saw a figure about her height leave her side of the room, walk to the bathroom, close the door, and turn on the light. I thought nothing of it and waited for her to finish. After about 5 minutes, the light turned off, the door opened, and the figure turned toward the stairs. I followed, wondering why she was up so late. As the figure entered the living room, it seemed to dissolve before my eyes. I turned on the light, but there was nothing there. No one in the living room or kitchen. Confused, I went back upstairs, turned on the bedroom light, and found my sister sound asleep in her bed. I barely slept for the rest of that trip. After that night, more unsettling things started happening. Luggage being thrown around, items going missing, things appearing in strange places. I haven't gone back to that island with my family since. Story 18. This might sound unbelievable, but it really happened. My family owns an old house in a small Louisiana town, and the backyard leads directly to a river. A couple of years ago, some friends and I decided to take a canoe out one night. About 10 minutes down the river, we came across an old houseboat tied to a tree. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. Being curious teenagers, we decided to check it out. 2 of my friends kicked the door open, and immediately we were hit with a horrible stench, followed by what sounded like someone screaming underwater, or maybe from behind a wall. We panicked and paddled away as fast as we could, never talking about it again. We spent the rest of the week trying to forget. The next year I went back with my sister. One night I woke up around 3 a.m. for no reason and looked toward the window. There was the silhouette of a man standing there, shaking violently and swaying side to side. I screamed for my sister, but by the time she came into the room, he was gone. The next night it happened again, but this time I could hear that same screaming from the direction of the river. It's happened every night I've stayed in that house since, always at exactly 3 a.m, whether I'm asleep or not. Sometimes other people have seen it too. The houseboat was eventually taken out of the water a few weeks ago, and nothing unusual was reported, but I can't stop thinking about it. For the longest time, I believed there must have been a body hidden in that boat, but I was too scared to go to the police. I haven't been back since they removed it, but I'm hoping that when I finally do, the man in the window will be gone. Story 19. When I was around 7 or 8 years old, I had a dream so vivid that I still remember every detail. It was strange because I rarely dreamed, and when I did, they were always childish and harmless. In this dream, I was sitting in a large chair in the living room of our family friend Marie. I recognized the room instantly. The hallway to her bedroom was on my right, and the kitchen was straight ahead. Sunlight shone through a window to my left, illuminating part of the floor, while the rest of the room stayed dim. I called out, but no one answered. Then I walked toward the hallway and saw a tall, slender figure standing there. It had no features, just a black silhouette darker than anything I'd ever seen. The moment it looked at me, all sound disappeared. It was like the world went silent, but the silence had a kind of static quality to it. I couldn't move, but for some reason I began walking toward it. My chest felt tight, and I looked down to see blood pooling in the carpet. Suddenly the figure rushed at me, and I woke up. The next day we went to visit Marie. I didn't tell anyone about the dream because my mother said it was just my imagination. That evening I was sitting in that same big chair watching television when Marie walked down the hallway toward her bedroom. For some reason, the memory of the dream came flooding back, and I started to cry. Right then she collapsed in the hallway, face first, as blood from her nose spread into the carpet. She had suffered a massive heart attack and died instantly. My mother tried to comfort me afterward, thinking I was just upset about her death. But the truth was that I had been crying before it happened. To this day, I remember every second of that dream, the light, the silence, the fear. I've always been skeptical about anything supernatural, but I can't shake the feeling that somehow my dream and her death were connected. Story 20. A few years ago, I was standing in the front yard talking with my mom while she watered her garden. Suddenly, we both heard a loud moaning sound coming from the upstairs window, my sister's room. My mom laughed and called out, "Hey, what are you doing up there?" But there was no reply, only more moaning. Curious and a bit concerned, we went inside and headed upstairs. My mom tried to open my sister's door, but it was stuck. She pushed harder and said, "This isn't funny, open the door." Finally, she managed to wedge it open just enough to look inside, and what she saw made her scream. My sister was lying on the floor in front of the door, foaming at the mouth and making strange noises. My mom screamed for me to call emergency services, and I did. When I looked inside, I saw a homemade Ouija board lying next to her on the floor. She had been playing with it by herself almost every day for the past month, but at the time I didn't think much of it. When the paramedics arrived, they said she had suffered a seizure and rushed her to the hospital. They ran every test imaginable and found nothing wrong. No signs of any medical condition, no prior history of seizures, nothing. She was perfectly healthy. 2 weeks later, she told me what happened that day. She said she had been using the Ouija board as usual when the piece started acting strange, moving rapidly across the board no matter what question she asked. Then it began spelling out messages telling her to take off her clothes. Suddenly, it started moving wildly, sliding around the board faster and faster. She heard multiple voices chanting over each other, saying, "The devil is here, the devil is here." And then her body froze. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, and the next thing she remembered was everything going black. I've never been one to believe in the paranormal or supernatural, but every time I think about that day, chills run down my spine. She has never had another seizure since, and the Ouija board disappeared after that night. I still can't explain what happened, but that memory has stayed with me ever since. Story 21. When I was 15, a family friend asked me to babysit their 4-year-old daughter overnight, and they said I could bring a friend. Their house was huge with 3 levels, a basement, a ground floor, and an upper level. Early in the evening, I noticed a small pickup truck pulling up in front of the house and idling loudly. It happened several times, and each time it made me more uneasy. My friend tried to calm me down, saying it was probably nothing and that we were in a nice neighborhood. But after dark, the truck came back again, this time parking farther down the street with its headlights off. I started to panic and told my friend to call my dad and ask him to come over. We lived about 20 minutes away, and I didn't want to call the police in case it turned out to be nothing. I grabbed the little girl, checked all the doors, and led everyone into one of the ground floor bedrooms. My friend told my dad I was overreacting, but after hearing the fear in my voice over the phone, he said he would come check things out. I read the girl her favorite bedtime stories until she fell asleep, while my friend talked quietly to her boyfriend in the next room. When my dad arrived, he saw the truck, walked around the house, checked all the doors, and then teased me for being paranoid before leaving. About 30 minutes later, the truck reappeared, idling in front of the house again, before driving away. Now even my friend started to look worried. I called my dad again, but he told me to stop calling and to relax. About an hour passed with no sign of the truck. My friend and I were sitting in the living room trying to calm down when, around midnight, we heard a faint whirring sound coming from the basement, like a power tool running. We looked at each other in shock and ran to the top of the basement stairs. The noise was unmistakable. Someone was drilling down there. My friend burst into tears. I told her to call my dad again while I grabbed the house phone to call emergency services. But when I picked it up, there was no dial tone. The line was dead. I handed my phone to my friend so she could try calling while I contacted the police myself. Holding the little girl, we ran upstairs to one of the bedrooms on the upper floor and locked ourselves inside. I stayed on the phone with the dispatcher, explaining everything while my friend sobbed quietly in the closet, clutching the child. The dispatcher told me the police were on their way and would arrive in about 20 minutes. It felt like forever. Then we heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming up the stairs. My heart was pounding. The dispatcher asked how many people I could hear. "One," I whispered. She asked how close he was. "2 rooms away," I said, trying not to cry. She told me to stay quiet. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I saw the shadow of feet under the crack and heard the doorknob rattle. My friend gasped and let out a sob from inside the closet. I couldn't even speak when the dispatcher asked what was happening. Then just as suddenly, the footsteps turned and started moving away, back down the stairs. We stayed frozen, listening until everything went quiet again. Finally, the dispatcher said the police were outside the house and asked me to move to the window. She told me to put my hand on the glass so officers could identify our location. Moments later, I saw flashlight beams sweeping across the windows as officers circled the house. They told us it was safe to come out. I carried the sleeping little girl while helping my friend walk downstairs. We met the police at the front door, and they went inside to search the house. About 20 minutes later, they came back out and told us there were signs of forced entry in the basement and dirt tracks leading up the stairs. But whoever had been there was gone. My dad arrived soon after, pale and silent. I'll never forget that night, the sound of the drill, the footsteps, and the terror of knowing someone had been inside that house with us the entire time. Story 22. This story isn't mine, but it's one that I'll never forget. My friend's mother, a kind-hearted and practical Canadian woman, told it one evening when a group of us were sitting around sharing stories. She's not the type to exaggerate or tell fishing tales, so when she started talking, everyone listened. She said it happened when she was a teenager. It was late at night during a huge snowstorm, the kind where you could barely see 10 or 15 feet in front of you. She was driving home, probably too fast for the conditions, when she approached a 4-way stop. At the same time, another car was coming from the side road, also moving too fast. She slammed on her brakes and braced herself for the crash, closing her eyes as the cars were about to collide, but the impact never came. When she opened her eyes, her car was sitting still on the other side of the intersection, completely untouched. Shaken, she got out to see what had happened. The other car was also stopped, and its driver was sitting behind the wheel, hands over his face, trembling. She walked over and asked what had happened. The man looked up at her, crying, and said, "Right when our cars should have hit, your car passed through mine. I felt a chill as you went right through me." She didn't believe him, of course, but she knew what she had felt, or rather, what she hadn't felt. There had been no impact, no screech, no damage, just an impossible moment of silence. The most remarkable thing about this story is that she's never been one to make things up or tell wild tales. Even decades later, she still gets emotional when she talks about it. She insists it happened exactly as she remembers, that for one strange, impossible instant, her car and another human being passed through each other as if the world had glitched. 40 years later, that memory still haunts her, and every time it snows heavily, she says she can still feel the chill of that night. Story 23. My grandmother had this eerie porcelain clown doll that she kept in the spare bedroom, the one with the bunk bed my sister and I used to share. It had a soft beanbag body, a thin white porcelain face, a small cone hat, and a disturbing little smile. When my sister Jenny and I were kids, I was about 10 or 11, and she was around 8. We used to imagine that thing as staring at us as we slept. Eventually, we decided to get rid of it. My grandmother lived in an apartment complex where each building had its own dumpster. There must have been at least a dozen scattered throughout the place. We thought that if we threw it into the one closest to our building, Grandma might find it and be angry, so we carried it far across the complex. We climbed up the side of a distant dumpster and tucked it under another garbage bag. That was the end of it, or so we thought. A few weekends later, when we came to visit, the doll was back sitting on the same shelf, in the same spot, staring straight at us. Jenny and I both screamed and asked Grandma where she had found it. She looked confused and said, "The clown doll, the one your Aunt Mary gave me. What about it?" Years later, as adults, my sister and I told that story at a party because we remembered every detail vividly. It was one of those stories that stuck in our heads for life. Sometime later, I was chatting online with my friend Tony and decided to tell him about it. He immediately freaked out, typing in all caps, and demanded that I describe the doll. I started with, "It had a skinny porcelain face," and he finished my sentence with "beanbag body." My stomach dropped. Then he said, "Single tear on its cheek?" And I replied, "Yes." Finally, he said, "Cone hat?" And I confirmed again. He called me right away, his voice shaking, and told me that when he was a child, his parents had bought him an identical clown doll while on vacation. He hated it so much that he threw it into the ocean. Years later, when he was in his late teens or early 20s, he found the exact same doll inside a box in his attic. Story 24. When I was in high school, I lived in the suburbs and commuted into the city by train. One morning, while switching trains, an old man walking toward me caught my attention. We accidentally blocked each other's paths and did that awkward sidestep shuffle before he smiled and said, "Hi." I said hello back and kept walking, thinking nothing of it, though his strange, fixed smile gave me an uneasy feeling. I got on my train and sat down, but then I noticed him again. The same man had followed me onto the train, the very same one he had just gotten off. He walked over and sat right next to me, no seat between us, just shoulder to shoulder. I glanced at his reflection in the window. He looked around 60 with messy gray hair and a ragged old jacket. I was trying to ignore him when he suddenly turned his head and stared directly at me. Then he said, "Hi," again. Trying to stay polite, I said, "Hi," back. That's when he asked, "Do you have a girlfriend?" I told him no, and he let out a weird little laugh before saying, "Well, I do." I just nodded and said, "That's nice." Then, without warning, he leaned in, rested his head on my shoulder, and whispered, "I love you." My entire body froze. The man across from us slowly lowered his newspaper and stared in disbelief. I wanted to disappear. Thankfully, the train was just pulling into the next stop. I jumped up, ran out of the car, ducked into another one, and then backtracked again to confuse him. When the train doors closed, the old man was left standing on the platform. He looked straight at me through the window as the train pulled away and blew me a kiss. When I finally got to school, I ran straight to the bathroom and scrubbed my jacket's shoulder with soap and water until my skin burned. To this day, I still remember the sound of his voice when he said those words and how cold my blood felt in that moment. Story 25. This might sound unbelievable, but everything I'm about to tell you happened in the same place, our laundry room. When my husband and I were still dating, he was home alone one evening, talking to me on his cell phone while doing laundry. Suddenly, he went quiet and said the washer had stopped running. He noticed the lid was open, which was odd because the machine can't operate unless it's closed. As he was explaining this to me, the call began to crackle like an old landline before going dead. When he called back, he sounded shaken and said that every hair on his body was standing up. He had heard someone laughing, and then the line cut out again. He was completely alone in the house. About a month later, after I moved in, I came home one night by myself. All the front windows were dark, and I remember thinking I should have left a light on. I went straight upstairs, lay on the couch, and fell asleep. When my husband came home about an hour later, he woke me up, and we both went downstairs. The light from the laundry room was on, shining into the hallway. I asked why he had turned it on, and he swore he hadn't even been down there. I knew it wasn't on before, because that room has a big picture window facing the street, and I would have seen it. Another time, we were babysitting our 1-year-old niece. Every time she fell asleep, the moment we brought her downstairs to our bedroom, right across from the laundry room, she would wake up screaming. We thought she might be sick and eventually called her parents to come get her. Later, while retelling the story to my husband's family, someone joked that maybe the baby could sense the ghost we had mentioned before. My husband laughed and said he would test that theory. He took the baby downstairs, but seconds later came back up pale as a sheet. He said when he opened the laundry room door, the baby waved toward the wall and said, "Hi." Not long after, we bought a large amount of meat and stored it in the freezer in that same room. A few days later, we found that the plug had been pulled out, just enough to stop the current. And this wasn't an easy plug to remove. It was a heavy-duty rubber one that takes effort to pull out. The creepiest part came when my sister-in-law mentioned something about the ring. I asked what she meant, and she explained that when my husband first bought the house, they had renovated the laundry room. While tearing down the drywall, they found a man's wedding ring hidden inside the wall. My husband had tossed it into his nightstand and forgotten about it. Hearing that made my stomach drop. I insisted they go back downstairs, apologize or whatever it took, and put the ring back where they found it. They did. Nothing strange has happened in that laundry room since. Story 26. In January of this year, I was in Sisophon, Cambodia, a small, remote town with my brother and 2 travel companions. We stayed at the only hotel in the area, an enormous old French colonial building with 14-foot ceilings, hardwood floors, and heavy teak doors. There were only 2 other groups of guests, a Chinese woman and her mother, and a group of 5 international aid workers ranging from their late 20s to early 40s. The hotel had 5 floors, and each group had an entire floor to themselves. Rooms cost only $4.50 per night, so after 3 months of cramped travel, we decided to spread out across the same floor, each taking our own room. That night I was dead asleep when the heavy door to my room began to slam violently against its frame. It was locked, but it shook as if someone were trying to tear it open with brute force. I had been woken up like this before by my travel friends, so at first I rolled over to check the time. It was 3:30 in the morning. A chill ran through me. None of my companions would be awake at that hour. I jumped up, braced myself by the door, and forced out a shaky, "Hello." The banging stopped instantly. The silence was suffocating. I stood perfectly still, straining to hear footsteps over the sound of my pounding heart. Nothing. I began to relax slightly and turn toward the bed. Then came the sound of hundreds of children laughing and running in the hallway outside. It was deafening, echoing, impossible. For 30 seconds, it sounded like a stampede of school children sprinting past my door before fading away completely. I stood there frozen, unable to make sense of what had just happened. I had never believed in anything supernatural before, but every hair on my body stood on end. I decided to run to my brother's room to see if he'd heard it too. I threw open my door and sprinted down the hall, only to nearly collide with him as he came rushing toward me. He had experienced the exact same thing, the door shaking violently, the laughter, the running feet. We ran to the next friend's room, pounded on the door, and when there was no answer, we panicked, thinking something had happened to him. We found him instead in the 4th traveler's room, both wide-eyed and pale, telling us they'd heard it all too. The next morning, we tried to ask the hotel owner if he knew anything about the building's history, but he spoke no English, and our Khmer vocabulary didn't go far beyond "thank you" and counting. So we never found out what happened that night. But I'll never forget it. I had gone to bed a skeptic and woke up believing that there are things in this world we may never understand. Story 27. The first thing to know is that I come from a culture that blends Christianity, Islam, and old folk beliefs. Something like voodoo, but without a name. It's ancient, mysterious, and fading now. The second thing to know is that my grandmother used to practice things involving black birds that would make both priests and animal lovers recoil, though for entirely different reasons. When I was 6 months old, I became gravely ill with what my family called a super flu. It was the kind of night you imagine in ghost stories, thunder roaring, rain crashing down, and fear hanging in the air. The local priest had been summoned to give me my last rites. As he finished praying, my grandmother entered the room, soaked from the storm, a heavy bag slung over her shoulder, something alive writhing inside it. She carried a huge kitchen knife and ordered everyone out. The priest started to protest but froze when she fixed her dark eyes on him. My relatives always tell that part the same way. Her 2 black eyes fell upon him, and he did not open his mouth again, not even to brush his teeth for a week. No one knows exactly what happened in that room after everyone left. My grandmother never told a soul, not even my parents. She even refused help cleaning the room afterward. What I do know is that I lived, and not only lived, but thrived. For years, I barely got sick at all. Then when my grandmother grew old and stopped helping others with her strange rituals, that invincible health began to fade. When I was 16 at a family gathering, my grandmother, rosy-cheeked from rum, called me into the kitchen. We spoke quietly for a while about small things, and then, without warning, she began telling me that same story. Hearing it from her lips was different. The tone of her voice, the way she described the storm, and the glint in her eye, it was like the air grew heavier. Her gaze turned to the dark window, her expression hard and distant. When she finally looked back at me, I felt an instinctive fear that I still can't explain. She said in a low, almost otherworldly voice, "This you must know. You alone. Don't tell your mother or your father. One day for the life you were given, a price will have to be paid." I've never asked what she meant about the price, the when, or the how. She passed away years ago, taking her secrets with her. I try to be a rational person, to laugh it off as drunken superstition. But sometimes when I walk home at night and the shadows seem to move just a little too strangely, I feel that cold rush of fear again. And I wonder when the time comes, how high will that price be? Story 28. My family owns a farm in upstate New York, and everyone pitches in to take care of it. The place has a strange and uncertain history. Some say it was once a stop for slave transport, others that it served as a slaughterhouse, or even something darker. Nobody knows for sure what's true. One day while the whole family was there, I went up into the barn loft and saw a neatly stapled pack of papers sitting on the counter. It looked ancient, like it had been typed on a typewriter a century ago, yet it was surprisingly clean and crisp. The packet detailed the entire history of the farm in an eerie level of precision, names of the families who built it. Every previous owner listed in chronological order, and bizarre stories attached to each. It gave me chills. I called my cousins over to look at it, and we flipped through the pages until we found a story about a girl who had been murdered on the farm on her prom night, wearing a white dress. Disturbed and curious, we ran to grab more family members to show them the document, leaving it exactly where I'd found it. When we returned, not even 2 minutes later, it was gone. We hadn't seen anyone enter or leave the barn, and everyone swore they hadn't touched it. My uncles and aunts thought we were just pulling a prank. That was about 10 years ago, and we never found the papers. Ever since then, it's been an inside joke about the girl in white haunting the farm. Years later, we decided to play a prank inspired by that story. We got one of our cousins drunk and had a friend put on a white lab coat to walk around the lake, pretending to be the girl in white. But that night was darker than expected, and our friend couldn't see well enough, so he dropped the coat near the water and came to hang out instead. While we sat by the lake laughing about how dumb the idea was, we noticed a completely white cat perched on a rock, watching us silently. We have plenty of barn cats, but we had never seen this one before, and we've never seen it since. The moment we noticed it, it jumped off the rock and vanished into the night. To this day, no one knows where that cat came from or what happened to that packet of papers. Story 29. I don't know if this qualifies as creepy, but it's something that has haunted me for years. This happened around 1987. I was 6 years old, and my family had just moved to a new neighborhood on the northern edge of a city in south-central Ontario. Behind our house stretched endless parkland, farmland, and dense woodland. To the south was suburbia, construction sites, winding side streets, and the perfect playground for a kid with a gold BMX bike and no video games or supervision. I loved exploring alone, riding down dirt trails and forest paths for hours. One day I found a stretch of woods I'd never seen before. It looked like other kids had been there, because narrow paths were packed hard enough for my bike tires. The trees were mostly sumac and cedar, tall and gnarled, forming a tangled canopy overhead. As I pedaled deeper, I started noticing bits of fabric fluttering from the branches and trash scattered across the ground. I figured it was from a bush party, which wasn't unusual, so I kept going, thinking I might even find some bottles to return for cash. But things got strange. I began seeing small, torn packets on the ground, hundreds of them. I picked one up, thinking it was ketchup, but the label said lubricant. I was 6 years old and didn't understand what that meant. I dropped it quickly and looked around. The rags hanging from the trees weren't rags at all. They were women's underwear. There must have been 30 pairs, pegged and tied to branches. My stomach twisted. Then I saw it, a filthy mattress, soaked in what I realized was blood. I froze. My instincts screamed at me to run, and I did. I didn't stop until I was back on a familiar road, shaking and out of breath. I never told anyone, not my parents, not my friends. I don't even know why. Maybe because I didn't fully understand what I had seen, or maybe because some part of me didn't want to. The path eventually led past an old, run-down house with rusted cars in the yard and a sinking porch.